Townes Van Zandt was a traveling troubadour whose body of work rivals that of any writer. His songs came from his life, and he lived his life with a robust abandon that made those songs some of the finest literature of the 20th century. This is the story of a true Texas legend, Townes Van Zandt. Townes, where were you born and where'd you grow up?
Well, Larry, I was born in Fort Worth in 1944, March 1944. And I lived there till I was about 10, and I moved out to Midland, Texas for about a year and a half. And then we moved to Billings, Montana for about 3.5 years, and then to Colorado, and then to a little place out of Chicago called Barrington, at which point I went away to a private high school for 2 years. And by the time I got out of high school, my parents had moved back to Houston. And I went to the University of Colorado from high school. So mostly Texas. I would say forever a Texan, you know. And secondly, Colorado. I spent a lot of time in. And I hope to see again someday.
Did you start writing as a young boy, write poetry and things like that? Or?
Oh, well, in high school I did. We had a serious old English teacher who made us memorize Shakespeare. You know, and being a private school, it was like 8 or 10 boys in a class, you know, that kind of education. Half of the guys were there because they couldn't be handled anywhere else, and half of the guys were there because of athletic ability, and, you know, some were there because of scholastic ability. And I kind of felt in between, pretty much.
So as a result of that education, you were steeped in the classics, all the great poets and Shakespeare and all that?
I think a lot more so than public schools do. And I can remember I wrote a play when I was a senior, and I wrote some sonnets. You know, just the rhyme scheme is so weird. I just want to see if I could do it and make any sense out of it, which I have these days. I have a couple of songs like that. I came upon a strange rhyme scheme, and just almost academically wanted to see if I could follow it through without throwing away any lines, you know, and still have it make sense.
Had you picked up a guitar by high school? Were you putting your poems to music?
I started, I guess, shortly after the Christmas, after I saw Elvis Presley on the Ed Sullivan Show, which I would have been 9 years old, I guess. And I saw that show with my older sister and her 2 girlfriends, because we had one of the few TVs in the neighborhood back then. And I saw the effect that Elvis had on these girls. And by that time I was starting to realize girls were somehow different than boys. And I watched Elvis drill these young ladies, and I just figured, wow, he's got all the money in the world, and he can have any car that he wants, and these girls love him, so there must be something to the guitar. So I asked my father if I could have one for Christmas. He said, well, if I promised to learn Fraulein, first song. And I promised him I would, and I did, and I got one for Christmas, and still sing Fraulein.
Do you recall the first time you played something that you wrote yourself for an audience that wasn't your family?
Well, pretty much. It was at the Jester Lounge in Houston, Texas, out Westheimer. And it was kind of the tail end of the folk boom, kind of the very tail end. But it was still going on enough to where the Jester would have 5 or 6 people play on any given night, you know, 3 or 4 songs each. And it would be full almost every night. You know, and the cover charge was $2 or whatever. K.T. Osland played there. Guy Clark played there. And
mid-60s, right?
And about 65, I guess, 64 or 5. And I played there, and I ended up, there were these folks that had come up from the serious traditional folk ranks, kind of. Guy Clark was singing Cotton Mill Girls and, you know, whaling ballads and traditional folk stuff. And Frank Davis, famous Houston character, was singing real traditional stuff and some Lead Belly. And they all played it and sang it better than I could, so I figured I needed just some different stuff. And I started writing. The first about 15 or 20 songs were kind of geared for the beer crowd. You know, kind of some of them off color, and a lot of talking blues and this, that, and the other. I mean, seriously geared for the beer crowd. I became the house opening act at the Jester, and they would bring people through, so I got to see all these people. I got to see Alan Dameron in his prime, and he really impressed me. It still does, I'm sure. A serious show, you know, entertainer-wise. I would just be awe-stricken that Alan would change shirts between sets. That was all right. And I got to see Doc Watson, and I got to meet Lightning Hopkins. And this whole time, and Jerry Jeff Walker, and opening for these guys. I just kind of began to realize that if I was going to the University of Houston at that time, and I was seriously being torn between staying in school and pre-law and playing the guitar. And the guitar slowly won out. It was a case of law school losing out as much as the guitar winning out.
Now, Bob Dylan had been around for 4 or 5 years then, releasing records. Had he been any influence on your writing at all?
Well, he was a big influence in that. Jerry Jeff was a big influence because all those people that I played with and opened for, Jerry Jeff was kind of the first one that really wrote his own stuff. Back when Little Bird, you know, his own songs, Ramblin', Gamblin', stuff like that. And I realized that that's what I'd been doing. I'd just been doing kind of a lighter version of it all. And then I think I clicked in. I started writing trying to write more serious stuff then, which turned out was not hard. It kind of was where I should have been, or it's where I evolved to. And I remember distinctly the first serious material I ever wrote was Waiting Around to Die, which is pretty serious.
Well, there's a beautiful song on that Our Mother of the Mountain album, which you've recorded since then as well, Tecumseh Valley, which really has the feel of a folk song to it, one that was passed down rather than written. Can you tell us about writing that song? I set about
to do that. Well, I wrote that when I was at the house entertainer at the 11th Door, which used to be is now, Symphony Hall? Is that what it is? Symphony Square. They redid that whole, it would have been easier to tear down the old building, I think, and build Symphony Square. Somehow they built Symphony Square around the old 11th Door. And I was the kind of house act there until the IRS padlocked it. And lived right up the street, up the hill, toward the Capitol on 11th Street, upstairs, and tinkered around with the banjo back then, and wrote that song, set out to write a folk song. And it was written on the banjo. And I heard, the only other song that I know of that being consciously done was by Steve Gillette, and his friend, whose name was Tom Campbell, wrote Darcy Farrell for a college. They were taking a folklore course in college, and the assignment was to write a folk song. And I sang Darcy Farrell for years, thinking it was a folk song. You know, I looked on the map to where the Truckee ran through, Virginia, you know. And then I met Steve Gillette and found that out. Tecumseh Valley's kind of like that.
Was it based on a true story that you had heard, or did you make up the story?
No, it was very loosely based on I think of one girl when I sang it, and still do.
A lot of your songs are just beautiful love songs. What was the inspiration for If I Needed You? Where'd that song come from?
Well, it is a pretty simple song. A lot of people play it at weddings, I found out. And it so happens that that song is unique in the fact that it's the only song that I ever wrote in my sleep. I was dead asleep. And it was kind of a weird sleep. I was living with, staying with Guy Clark and Susanna Clark in this little teeny house over in East Nashville. And somebody got the flu, and so we immediately, all three of us had the flu. And we were getting a bottle of codeine cough syrup every day and splitting it 3 ways. And we had to draw straws who walked up to the corner, which was about a quarter of a mile, to the drugstore, because Guy's VW didn't run as usual, to get the cough syrup, and I always lost, it seems like. They were looking at Tennessee, they were looking at me like scum of the earth because I was buying this codeine cough syrup, and I was coughing, my eyes were running. I mean, if anybody ever needed it, and they still looked at me like scum of the earth. But anyway, so my sleep was just saturated with these technicolor dreams, most vivid dreams you can imagine. And I was laying on my little bed. It was a little kind of storeroom, and a mattress on the floor with a little light beside it. And I always had a pad and a pencil there, and some books and stuff, and my guitar was against the wall. And I was sleeping one night, and I had a dream, and I dreamt that I was, a traveling folk singer, and I was up in front of these people, and I sang this song, and it was If I Needed You. And it was so intense that it woke me up, and I reached over and turned on the light and wrote down the words. There's 3 verses to that song, and then the first verse is repeated. And I knew the guitar part had been so clear that I didn't even get off the mattress and go get my guitar. I remembered it, and I just went back to sleep. And in the morning, we all got up, kind of had coffee and stuff like that. And after that, I said, hey, Guy, listen to this song. And I played If I Needed You, with the guitar part, which has never been changed. I played it right the first time. And he said, man, that's a beautiful song. That's yours? I said, yep. He said, when did you write it? Last night. And I said, no, man, you went to sleep before we did. You couldn't have. Did you get up? And it was like, no, I wrote it in my sleep, and I wrote it down. I woke up long enough to write it down. It's like, wow, that's amazing, man. That's a good one. I talked to you, my first thought was, man, I got to get some more of that codeine cough syrup. I thought about walking in and telling the doctor I just have an open-ended prescription for codeine cough syrup because I needed to make a living, to right. I figured, well, that probably wouldn't fly. I had to change, Larry, one line in that song, where it goes, ladies with me now.
Since I showed her how.
Since I showed her how to lay her lily hand in mine. Well, that line in the dream was, she lowed like a cow when I showed her how. And I sent it off to New York, and they kind of called back to the publishing company, and it was kind of, Townes, that's a beautiful song, but, lowed like a cow, you don't think that's a bit much? Well, okay.
Now, the song that you're probably most well known for, Poncho and Lefty, you're just outside of Dallas when you wrote that one.
30 miles north of Denton.
Tell us the story about that song, how it came to you.
That song, because of Billy Graham and the Guru Maharaji playing Dallas the same time I did, there were no hotel rooms anywhere around Dallas. And my friend Daniel and I ended up in this crummy little rundown place with no Coke machine, no TV, no telephone, and it was about 50 miles out of town was the closest we could get, because Billy Graham drew like 500,000 people from all over the world, and the Guru drew like 300,000. So every room within 60 miles of Dallas was taken. And I sat there for 3 days, and we would had a 3-day gig, and we'd drive into Dallas and play the gig, drive back to this hotel room. And about the 2nd or 3rd day, I decided what I'm going to do is sit down in this chair and write a song, and I'm not going to move. which wasn't terribly difficult because there was nowhere to move to. You know, I could get out and walk out and take a look at the bullfrog in the broken swimming pool. And I sat there for about 3 or 4 hours, and through the window, that first line came. Living on the road, my friend, was going to keep you free and clean. And then something took over. That's another one of the ones I was talking about. The only conscious particular thought I had about that song was it's not about Pancho Villa. I knew that for a fact. Other than that, it just kind of came. I made no major. I added a verse. I added the last verse. I went in the second night and played it at the Rubaiyat Club, and my late friend B.W. Stevenson was there, and he was a good friend of mine, and he sat there and listened to it. I said, "Hey, B.W., here's a new song," because he was about the only one in the audience. Everybody else was either Billy Graham or the Guru, and I played it. He said, "Yeah, man, that's a good song, but I don't think it's finished." Okay, so the next day I wrote the third verse, and it kind of came to also.
Had you been carrying the characters Pancho and Lefty around in your head?
No, not before that day. I'd never thought of either one.
Tell me about how you met Blaze Foley and some of those early adventures you had with Blaze.
Well, I was playing the bitter end in New York, and Blaze came down. It was kind of the last night, I think, of that gig. It was like a 4-day, 3-day type deal. And I finished playing, and up walks this strange-looking guy. And he introduced himself and said he was Blaze Foley and, from Texas, and he'd heard about me, and he's from Austin. And I hadn't been to Austin too much for a while because I was living in Nashville and been on the road. We became immediate friends. And there's two West Texans in New York. And I'd been there kind of before, and he never had. But he had a room at the Gramercy Park Hotel, which is a hotel a lot of us stay at. And some well-meaning record guy had given Blaze the power to sign his own tab, carte blanche room tab, anything you could sign for in the hotel. And so I moved in with Blaze. I moved out of my hotel and moved in with Blaze, and he was supposed to stay there for however many days to do something, meet somebody. And we bankrupted the record company. We were just drove room service into the ground. We'd order 30 tequila sunrises, one hamburger cut in half, and tip the guy, old black man, $60 or $70. And when this went on day and night for 3 days until the record company heard about it and arranged for us to fly to Nashville. It was cheaper to fly us to Nashville, where I lived, than it was to, put up with Blaze. It was wild times. There was every day with old Blaze was kind of some sort of an adventure.
He cut an album in Muscle Shoals. You went to Muscle Shoals for those sessions, didn't you?
That was a real adventure. I have a song, Blaze's Blues, which that little trip was kind of mentioned. And that kind of almost the same thing happened. I just had a new son born, my wife and I, and I'd planned it to be home until Will was, a month old or so, and then go back and play gigs. I get this call from Blaze, and he's in Alabama, and he's in Atlanta at that point, and he's going to do a record in Muscle Shoals with this bunch of guys, and he wants me to be there. I told him, Blaze, I just can't. We had a baby a day and a half ago or so. And he was like, oh man, you got to, it just wouldn't be the same if you weren't here too. Blaze, I can't, this is the best pickers in the world. There's nothing I can add. I can't hardly sing harmony, this, that, and the other. And he said, well, you probably sing some harmony, and, you just be around. I'd have a buddy to hang around with, this, that, and the other. And he kept calling and calling. I kept saying no. And finally it just got to where, just to keep him from calling, it's like, okay, but you have to get your friend, your record company, to buy the tickets, and I'll fly to Atlanta. You know, we can ride in your record company's private airplane, which was part of the argument why I should go. They had their own airplane, and I was going to be treated like royalty and this and that and the other, so, which didn't make much difference to me. But finally, just because Blaze was calling me day and night, I just decided, well, I'll go for a couple of days, few days. So we got there. I got to Atlanta, met his these young guys are our age, you know, who owned this record company, and had a private plane and had a bunch of gold chains on. I noticed that right off, and got in their private plane and flew to Muscle Shoals and landed, and somebody picked us up and drove us to a motel, and the head guy from the record company told Blaze and I that we were to wait at the hotel. They checked us in. We were to wait at the hotel for 2 days. First, it started until the next day, because they were going to go check on trading this airplane for another airplane. So we go into the hotel. And I found out as soon as we got to the hotel room that they had given Blaze $300 cash. So there we are. Don't know anybody in northern Alabama. $300, and it didn't take us any time at all to figure out the logistics were. You called a cab, and you took a about 6-minute cab ride across the Tennessee River, where you bought a pint of vodka, and then a 6-minute cab ride back. The cab ride was $5. So we figured that out right away. And we sat there and we watched a football game, and, you know, just very serene and cool, waiting for him the next day, the next morning. The next morning came, and no record company, because to be 10 or 11 noon. So we take another cab ride. We get a fifth of vodka, come back to the room. And that night, still no record company, no word. And it started dawning on me like, Blaze, yeah, and you know, I think I know what kind of guys you're mixed up with. I mean, they're not thinking about you sitting here in this hotel room. You know, I mean, it may be a week before they get back. And so Blaze kind of kicked into gear. Maybe you shouldn't even have said that, but Blaze kind of kicked into gear, and it ended up after about 4 days. Blaze is telling, he's like over peeking through the curtains. He's claiming to see Iranians with Uzi submachine guns around the pool and stuff like that. And I was trying to keep him under control, and finally I decided I can't stand anymore. And I was like no angel this whole time. And we've been in this one little room. It got to where Blaze wouldn't leave the room. It was terrible. And I got on the phone, and I decided, well, I'm going to get Guy Clark to send me enough money, and I'm going to take a bus to Nashville. And once I'm in Nashville, I can somehow get a plane ticket back to Texas, and I'll be home, and Blaze can do his record. But things by then were like much, you know, beyond what I was, you know, best laid plans of mice and men. But anyway, I got on the phone to call Guy, and I don't know who Blaze thought I was phoning, but he jumped over the bed and ripped the phone out of the wall. At which point, and the whole room was pretty much, his half of the room at least was trashed. And when the phone was ripped out of the wall, the motel operator became real interested and came up to see if everything was all right. I don't know what Blaze said to him at the door of the room, but he retreated and called the Florence, Alabama police, who arrived. And I was put into the unenviable position of being the peacemaker, which was all I managed to do was keep Blaze from being beaten to death and maybe even shot, you know, by these Alabama police who just, Blaze was in a rage, which he really could go into sometimes. I've seen Blaze at his most gentle and his most outrageous, and the Alabama cops were not amused, and being called Nazi pigs and such by this screaming giant hippie. And one of them was, at one point, one of them was reaching for a club, and the other one was reaching for his gun. So I jumped in the middle and talked as fast as I could about Blaze was really okay. He was just drunk, and we've been here for 4 days. So they just handcuffed Blaze, threw him in the back, and then kind of looked around at me. And I thought for an instant, you know, just a brief flashing minute, that they were going to let me go. And I couldn't, I mean, what was I going to do? I didn't have any money. They certainly weren't going to let me back in the motel. So, you know, and anyway, one of them said, "Take that SOB too," handcuffs, and woke up in the Florence, Alabama jail, which is one of the worst places I've ever been. 30 or 40 minutes later, the people that had picked us up at the airport came and picked me up and drove around the courthouse a couple more times, and there was Blaze. So we're a happy little crew. Was back. The owners of the record company were still gone on whatever errand it was. And I got word that the owners were mad, I mean blazingly angry at me for throwing a wrench into their record operation. And this is after I'd been drug away from my day-and-a-half-year-old kid, told I was going to be treated like royalty, and all of this had happened. And I just said, man, that's enough for me. You know, they were saying, boy, you're lucky. What's your name and what's your name aren't here, man. And I said, just give me $10. Give me enough money for a bus ticket to Nashville, and buy me a half pint of vodka and a Coke, and drop me off at the bus station. And you won't ever have to worry about me again. I don't want to talk to anybody about anything anymore. And which they did, you know, and Blaze felt terrible about it. And the next bus to Nashville was about 4 hours, 5 hours. And they drove back up a couple of times because Blaze had explained the whole situation and told him that I had saved his life and it wasn't my fault, and my poor baby was at home, and and finally found out the owners also got the information, and I got, they apologized, you know, and by this time I was back in Texas. I can't remember being as mad at a group of people as, right? And they would come back by and say that the owners had decided that it'd be perfectly all right if I stayed around. It was just like, the bus is in 2 more hours. When you want to just hang around with us, you don't want to sit here in the bus station. I'll just sit here. Thank you very much. And then, like I didn't know that record ever came out, but you told me it did. And, shortly after that, the owners were indicted for, I think, conspiracy to, sell drugs or something.
I heard the FBI ended up with the masters to that album.
Man, the FBI got one of Blaze's records. I hope they listen to it.
Townes, you've got a song that so far at this recording has not appeared on any of your records, but it's a song about one of the topics that's in the forefront of American thought, and that's homeless people. Your song, Marie. Would you tell me about that song?
Well, I was in a hotel room in Los Angeles. It's kind of the only song that I've kind of picked out what I wanted to write about, which makes it, I guess, a topical song. I don't have hardly many straight topical songs, unless you kind of stretch. You can stretch almost anything into some kind of topic, I suppose most of mine are like spiritually topical. And this is, I think Marie's pretty much a straight topical song. I'd like to, do more. But I knew in advance I'm going to write a song about the homeless. That I had that idea, before the first line came. And I wrote it in one afternoon in a hotel room in Los Angeles, and I played it the first time that night, which I was traveling with my old buddy Guy Clark, and it just amazed him. But he's done that before too. He generally crafts his songs a little more, and the idea of just having the idea for one the night before, and writing it the next afternoon, and playing it that night, he thought that was amazing. But it just, it happened that way. I think it's a real powerful song. I wish Blaze could have heard that song. Blaze, who I talk about a lot, is an old friend of both of us, because he was really interested in the dispossessed in the world, in America and in the world. And I thought about Blaze a lot while I was writing that song. I wasn't writing it about him or anything, but part of the reason I wrote it was, because he had so much to do with turning me on to that problem.
And he had just recently passed when you wrote that song.
Yeah, I'm convinced he had a lot to do somehow with that song.
One of your most recent songs is a visit into another world, The Hole. Tell me about that song and then play it for us. Would you do that?
Well, The Hole is, I think, I didn't mean it to be autobiographical, but I'm sure it is, and it is for a lot of people. It's just kind of losing your way in the pleasures of this life, getting bogged down with the wrong, getting bogged down under the wrong value system, which has happened to me, and I've I still deal with it all the time, but I've, managed to pull myself up a bit from it. It's always, I've never been the stablest of people, but I'm doing real well now for the last 5 or 6 years with an occasional hard time. But 10 or 15 years ago, there was nothing much into my life except self-gratification, one form or another. And then also the, heavy, I don't know how to explain it. There's just been, I never got along with life very well. And that song is kind of about those days. And, there's other people, a whole lot of people that have been through that, that'll understand this song, I'm sure.
Was that a hard song to write, or did that just come out real quick like some of those?
It took a little bit of crafting, but I kind of knew where it was going, the whole time. I mean, it didn't come out in a rush like Mr. Mud and Mr. Gold, which is kind of, they have some things in common. They're both kind of spoken, and they're both in a minor key. It took a couple of days. And the name, The Hole, was just put on it for easy. I mean, I never believed too much in titles. You get real wound up in titles when what you're supposed to be wound up in the song. So after I thought about this title or that title or the other title, Janine just said, "Why don't you just call it The Hole?" That's good, The Hole. And a friend of mine said it should be called Green-Eyed Lady of the Lowlands.
You did some road work with Cowboy Junkies. You played a long tour with them.
That was a long tour. That was my first, or my only serious bus tour with where you carry your whole, they carry all of their own lights, their own sound. That whole crew was, I think, 24 people, counting roadies and the junkies and me, the road manager and the production manager. It was real interesting. It was real fun and interesting. There was 2 buses, one for the roadies and one for the Cowboy Junkies and me and the road manager, and one great big semi. It was 2 months with a little break. It was about 2 months and about 45 gigs or so. It's really interesting. The roadies are amazing to break down a whole stage, and travel and have the whole stage set up by the time we got there for the sound check. The sound checks were just like everything. I've never seen crews like that work before.
These were concert halls as opposed to bar rooms.
There were a lot of, renovated theaters, and we had an occasional bar sort of setting, but they were like giant bar, like the Texas Opry House type bars. The average audience was about 2,000 or whatever.
You don't specifically write songs for other people, but in this case you did write a song for Cowboy Junkies. Did you write it during the tour or after?
During. And I would take what I'd written to Michael, a certain line. Michael, what do you think about? He's the leader of the elder brother of the Junkies. Margot is his sister, and Pete, the drummer, is their other brother. The original band was Michael and Al, the bass player, and they played together, and then they got Margot and Pete in on it, whenever that was, a long time ago. But I'd take it to Michael. We'd all become like family in it, just for an experiment. So what do you think about this line? Do you think that's too goofy? Oh, no, man, that's great. I just worked on it for a few weeks, to where at the end I had to tell him, and if I got it finished, and right about when the tour was ending, and I told him that I'd get it to where I knew it and make a demo of it and send it to him. And I told him, like don't feel like you have to record this, you know. And I just wrote it for y'all, and in their presence and everything. And I was serious. I didn't want them to feel like, God, we have to, you know. I let them know that I wasn't going to feel bad or hurt or anything if they just kept it. So I just did it to see if I could do it. It was real fun. And lo and behold, they did record it, which is nice.
They recorded that, wrote a song called Townes' Blues, and also put out a single of To Live Is to Fly, right?
Uh-huh. Well, I think it was the flip side of the single, or it was one of the songs on the single, I think.
Lightnin' Hopkins, big influence on your guitar playing. Did you ever meet Lightning? Spend any time with him?
Well, a bit. I played with him, the same shows quite a bit, and I opened for him a lot. In the Gesture, I've been to his house a few times at the Chez Orleans apartment, and we became. He knew me. He knew who I was. I don't think he ever quite got my name straight, but my friend and played bass with me for a long time, Rex Bell, ended up playing with Lightning for 7 or 8 years. So that was I think it was because they both make the same mistakes at the same time, or they're not even really mistakes, but they'll leave out a bar, and they happen to do it kind of at the same time, And after 8 years of gigs, he kept calling Rex Rick, and Rex corrected him a couple times. Lightning, it's Rex, not Rick, it's Rex. Okay, Rick. So after a couple of times of that, it was just Rick forever. So any trouble he had with my name, I just kind of didn't even think about it. But I did learn that I learned from Lightning, from records of Lightning, before I ever saw him. I remember when I saw him, I was surprised. I was just looking through a newspaper in Houston. I'd been turned on to him in high school, and then in college at the University of Colorado is where I really started listening. And when I saw his name at the Bird Lounge, Lightnin' Hopkins, the Bird Lounge for $3, I was just floored. I hadn't even been looking at him as a human, or much less a human that was still alive or that would play somewhere that I could go. Right? I remember the first night of seeing Lightning and sitting down at his table afterwards. But anyway, I learned from Lightning that you can hit very different notes, on the guitar, as opposed to strumming. Like as opposed to this, you can, you know what I mean.
Your song, Brand New Companion, sounds like Lightnin' Hopkins could have written that song.
Yeah, I wrote it for that reason, just a Lightning tribute. Sounded like kind of a cheap imitation of Lightning. He was quite the guitar player.
Townes Van Zandt died at the age of 52 on New Year's Day, 1997, the anniversary of the death of Hank Williams. He toured and recorded until the final days of his life. One of Townes' last recordings was a duet with Barb Donovan of his song, I'll Be Here in the Morning.
There's no stronger wind than the one that blows down a lonesome railroad line. No prettier sight than looking back on a town you left behind. There's nothing that's as real as the love that's in my mind. So close your eyes, I'll be here in the morning. Close your eyes, I'll be here for a while.
there's lots of things along the road I'd surely like to see. I'd like to lean into the wind and tell myself I'm free. But your softest whispers, louder than the highways, call to me. So close your eyes, I'll be here in the morning. Close your eyes, I'll be here for a while.
All the mountains and the rivers and the valleys can't compare to your bluely dancing eyes and yellow shining hair. But I can never hit the open road and leave you lying there. Close your eyes, I'll be here in the morning. Close your eyes, I'll be here for a while.
Lay your head back easy, love. Close your crying eyes. I'll be laying here beside you when the sun comes on the rise. I'll stay as long as the cuckoo wails and the lonesome blue jay cries. Close your eyes, I'll be here in the morning. Close your eyes, I'll be here for a while. I'll close your eyes, I'll be here in the morning. Close your eyes, I'll be here for a while. About 15 or 20 songs were kind of geared for the beer crowd. You know, kind of some of them off color and a lot of talking blues and this, that, and the other. I mean, seriously geared for the beer crowd. I became the house opening act at the Jester, and they would bring people through, so I got to see all these people. I got to see Alan Dameron in his prime, and he really impressed me. He still does, I'm sure. A serious show, you know, entertainer-wise. I would just be awe-stricken that Alan would change shirts between sets. That was all right. And I got to see Doc Watson, and I got to meet Lightning Hopkins. And this whole time, and Jerry Jeff Walker, and opening for these guys. I just kind of began to realize that if I was going to the University of Houston at that time, and I was seriously being torn between staying in school and pre-law and playing the guitar. And the guitar, and it was kind of the tail end of the folk boom, kind of the very tail end. But it was still going on enough to where the Jester would have 5 or 6 people play on any given night, you know, 3 or 4 songs each, and it would be full almost every night. You know, and the cover charge was $2 or whatever. K.T. Oslin played there. Guy Clark played there. And
mid-60s, right?
Uh-huh. And about 65, I guess, 64 or 5. And I played there, and I ended up, there were these folks that had come up from the serious traditional folk ranks, kind of. Like Guy Clark was singing Cotton Mill Girls and, you know, whaling ballads and traditional folk stuff. And Frank Davis, famous Houston character, was singing real traditional stuff and some Lead Belly. And they all played it and sang it better than I could, so I figured I needed just some different stuff. And I started writing the first...
Had you picked up a guitar by high school? Were you putting your poems to music?
I started, I guess, shortly after the Christmas, after I saw Elvis Presley on the Ed Sullivan Show, which I would have been 9 years old, I guess. And I saw that show with my older sister and her two girlfriends, because we had one of the few TVs in the neighborhood back then. And I saw the effect that Elvis had on these girls. And by that time I was starting to realize girls were somehow different than boys. And I watched Elvis drill these young ladies, and I just figured, wow, he's got all the money in the world, and he can have any car that he wants, and these girls love him, so there must be something to the guitar. So I asked my father if I could have one for Christmas. He said, well, if I promised to learn Fraulein, first song. And I promised him I would, and I did, and I got one for Christmas, and still sing Fraulein.
Do you recall the first time you played something that you wrote yourself for an audience that wasn't your family?
Well, pretty much. It was at the Jester Lounge in Houston, Texas, out Westheimer.
Townes Van Zandt was a traveling troubadour whose body of work rivals that of any writer. His songs came from his life, and he lived his life with a robust abandon that made those songs some of the finest literature of the 20th century. This is the story of a true Texas legend, Townes Van Zandt. Townes, where were you born, and where'd you grow up?
Well, Larry, I was born in Fort Worth in 1944, March 1944. And I lived there till I was about 10, and I moved out to Midland, Texas for about a year and a half. And then we moved to Billings, Montana for about 3.5 years, and then to Colorado, and then to a little place out of Chicago called Barrington, at which point I went away to a private high school for 2 years. And by the time I got out of high school, my parents had moved back to Houston. And I went to the University of Colorado from high school. So mostly Texas. I would say forever a Texan, you know. And secondly, Colorado. I spent a lot of time in. And I hope to see again someday.
Did you start writing as a young boy, write poetry and things like that? Or?
Oh, well, in high school I did. We had a serious old English teacher who made us memorize Shakespeare. You know, and being a private school, it was like 8 or 10 boys in a class, you know, that kind of education. Half of the guys were there because they couldn't be handled anywhere else, and half of the guys were there because of athletic ability, and, you know, some were there because of scholastic ability. And I kind of felt in between, pretty much.
So as a result of that education, you were steeped in the classics, all the great poets and Shakespeare and all that?
I think a lot more so than public schools do. And I can remember I wrote a play when I was a senior, and I wrote some sonnets. You know, just the rhyme scheme is so weird. I just want to see if I could do it and make any sense out of it. Which I have these days. I have a couple of songs like that. I came upon a strange rhyme scheme, and just almost academically wanted to see if I could follow it through without throwing away any lines, you know, and still have it make sense.